Thanks very much. As we're not quite as large a company or as well known as GSK, I'll perhaps just start by telling you a little about Cambridge Cognition. We are a neuroscience digital health company. We're about 70 people, mostly in Cambridge, UK, but with a small office also in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And really what we do is translate the best findings coming out of academic neuroscience research in terms of new ways to measure how the brain is functioning in non-invasive ways, so using computer tests to measure different aspects of brain function. And we take these, productize them, make them scalable, make them usable by non-experts, and then allow them to be used in clinical trials, in healthcare, and of course by other academic institutions around the world. Much of our original technology was based from discoveries in the University of Cambridge, but in the last few years we've started working more closely with academics in the School of Psychology in Bristol, and I wanted to come and tell you about some of the projects that we are involved in here. Now, rather helpfully, the last two PhD students gave a great introduction to this work, because most of what we're doing here is thinking about how digital mental health applications can best be developed and implemented on mobile phones. So you probably can't read this graphic in great detail, but it's really just to make the point that digital health is particularly pertinent to mental health because mental health is massively underserved. There are lots of people out there with mental health problems that are getting no help through current treatment pathways. And indeed, this is reflected if you go to the App Store and look at the number of health applications that are on it. Around a third of them that are disease-specific are to do with mental health. So we know that there's a huge need, and we know that there is actually a consumer or a patient pull for applications to do with mental health. If you look on the App Store, what you will find are an awful lot of applications that have been developed not in academic research groups, but by innovators, startups, digital techie nerds in their garages. And these apps tend to have a really nice user experience. So, of course, they come from companies that are really good on user interface and that kind of thing. The best apps are really sticky. So not only do you want to download them once, but actually you get something from using them. So you keep coming back and using them again, which, as we heard earlier, you need to be using something for it to be making a difference. And of course, some of these companies that have big marketing budgets behind them, big venture capital funds behind them, can get awareness in doctors' minds, in patients' minds, in consumers' minds, and can run big marketing campaigns. So that's kind of what a lot of the App Store is full of. On the other hand, what is coming out of academic and clinical groups in particular tends to be quite different from that. It tends to be things that have a very strong theoretical basis, that have been developed with clinician input, so that they're, they've got a really good chance of doing something useful for patients. And indeed, they tend to have been put through kind of a rigorous scientific process in terms of developing the evidence base, and maybe have even been put through something like a randomized controlled trial that you might think of as a gold standard for any new intervention. So there tends to be this gap in that there is a lot of digital health activity going on in both of these spheres, but there's very little overlap between these spheres. And that's one of the reasons we think that this is a really good area that's ripe for collaboration between academia and industry. So what we're trying to do to bridge that gap is really to solve two particular challenges. One is that to make a difference in patients' lives, we have to get these devices into the hands of the patients that are going to benefit. So there are a number of ways of doing that, and I'll talk about some of those that we think are appropriate here. But essentially, it's no good having the best application in the world if it isn't somehow found and used by the right patient. And then linked to that is how you support that in the long term. So it may be possible to get a grant to develop a new technology, and that's great. But eventually you're going to have to find a sustainable business model. And that's because even a fully evidence-based, ready-for-use application, we all know it has to go out and be updated every so often. iOS are going to bring out a new operating system, and you're going to have to update your app to account for that. And then there are these issues around regulatory concerns, data protection. All these kinds of things are things that the academic originators of great ideas are not necessarily best placed to deal with, but they need to be dealt with if this application is really going to make a difference in the world. So if my video works now, we're going to do a brief cognitive test. I thought at this stage in the afternoon, particularly for those of you that didn't get the coffee, this would be a good chance to do it. And this is, in fact, the face-based test that one of the PhD students was talking about earlier. So let's hope that we can make it work. So if this works, you're going to see on the screen some pictures of faces. They're going to flash up very quickly. And your job is just to decide whether the face that you see is happy or sad. Okay? So what was that? Happy. Good. Everybody's awake. Sad. Okay, so those two are quite easy. Let's try a couple of harder trials. What was that? Happy? Okay. You're agreeing so far? Sad. Okay. So you can see those last two were much more difficult. They were much more ambiguous faces. And the reason for that is because the clever researchers in the School of Psychology, when they developed this test, they were they were doing a number of studies to develop the psychometric properties of the test so that we can tweak how difficult it is to make that decision. So if I show you a face that is 100% happy, most people find that very easy. If I show you a face that is only 55% happy, morphed with a face that's 45% sad, it's very ambiguous, particularly when we show it to you at that very brief period. And why this matters is because in that very ambiguous decision-making process, then that's where something like being a bit depressed or having a low mood starts to influence the way that you interpret that information. So this is just one nugget, one simple piece of cognitive technology that we can use in a number of different ways. And our intention in working with Bristol is to develop some more of these nuggets as we go forward. But this particular one has been used in 3 ways at the moment. The emotion recognition task, which is a kind of simple form of the task where you see faces with 6 different emotions, and you are making a choice as to which of those 6 emotions it is. This is kind of the most established form of the task now, and it's now available. We've moved it into our standard cloud-based cognitive testing platform, which is called Cantab. So this can be used and is being used now in large-scale research studies all around the world. So that's a simple sort of productization and scaling piece that we've been able to do. The newer version of that, where those ambiguous faces become particularly informative, is the emotion bias task. So here we're not judging, can you tell which face is which? We're judging in those ambiguous faces, which way are you more likely to swing? So when you're not sure, are you more likely to interpret ambiguous information as positive or as negative? This is a task that seems particularly useful in people who may be on the pathway to depression, and we think that it may reflect something about the causal pathway. So as was described earlier, if you're a person who is seeing an excess of negative things in the world around you, this may help to reinforce your depression and be a kind of vicious cycle. So our interest in this is, that's kind of a cool scientific tool that we can use to help understand things like depression. It's also potentially really useful in drug development and in clinical practice, because what we think this might be is a biomarker for mood state. So at the moment we ask people, how do you feel today? How have you felt over the past 2 weeks? We only have subjective measures really in mental health to understand these diseases. And there are lots of problems with that. You're asking people who have a depressed mood how they've been feeling over a long period of time. They might have memory problems as well. So it's not the kind of most precise way of measuring change in mood state or the effects of an intervention, for example. So we think this bias-based task may be a more precise biomarker that we can now start to use in clinical trials. And the third version is a training procedure that has potential to be used as an intervention, which Steph talked about earlier. So the idea here is, when you show these ambiguous trials, you can tweak people's behaviour. So if I show you a face that is 55% happy, 45% sad, and you say sad, I go, no, that was happy. And I can get you to recognise more happiness over time. So over time, this training procedure rewards people for becoming more sensitive to the positive things in their environment versus the negative things in their environment. So that's starting to shift from a assessment into an intervention. And this has actually been work that's been done as part of a knowledge transfer partnership, which is a Innovate UK funding mechanism for getting academic knowledge out of universities and into commercial organisations. So knowledge transfer partnerships can be for pre-doctoral or postdoctoral associates. We have a postdoc associate at the moment, based predominantly at Cambridge Cognition, with spending time down here in the School of Psychology. And she's been running RCTs through an online mechanism called Prolific Academic in order to recruit people, have them take part in this training mechanism over 4 sessions and look at what happens to them. And what we've learned so far is that 4 training sessions is enough to reliably shift people's emotion perception. So we're quite good at training people to see more positivity in the world. And in people who previously were showing a negative bias, this does seem to improve their self-reported quality of life. This is in healthy volunteers. I've just heard the data yesterday from a follow-up study in people who are taking SSRIs, so presumably people who have a diagnosis of depression or certainly some mood and anxiety symptoms. And these individuals also seem to be showing a shift in the right kind of direction. So this very simple digital intervention seems to be helping people to experience more positivity in their lifetime. These data aren't robust yet. We don't have enough to be going around making a strong case for intervention at this point, but I think it's a stepping stone towards where we can start taking these nuggets of good academic science into real-world applications. So this is Cambridge Cognition's responsibility really in the partnership. And what we have that we can bring to that are a couple of things. Firstly, we already have in our customer base a bunch of people who work in pharmaceutical companies, in healthcare delivery platforms, in medical device organisations, and these are people who are putting things into patients' hands. So the organisation that develops drugs is getting those into patients' hands. Healthcare networks obviously working with patients every day. And this is a really important part, finding the right channel to get these effective tools to a patient is absolutely key to the business model, but also to success. So we're working in a number of areas. We're investigating a number of these different channels in the form of commercial partnerships and collaborations at the moment to build evidence and get these applications out there. I wanted to finish by telling you about the next phase of this. So we are continuing to work on the specific projects, but we're also broadening out the range of our collaboration with the TARG, which is the Tobacco and Alcohol Research Group in Bristol. And essentially, we're setting up a joint team together. It's going to be a little team to start with, of people sat predominantly in Bristol, employed by Cambridge Cognition. And what we're trying to do here, I think, is a good example of how these academic industry collaborations ought to work, which is that the academic team are bringing their new ideas and knowledge about the best scientific evidence that's out there at the moment. And conversely, the Cambridge Cognition team are bringing their ideas and knowledge about the market that's out there at the moment, the needs that are out there in the real world. Both of those organisations are capable of building prototypes, running experimental studies, but then again there is some divergence between them. Because of our work with pharmaceutical partners and in large-scale clinical trials, so we have about 40 clinical trials that we're working on at any one time, that means we have the opportunity to put things into real-world, consented, but large-scale research studies relatively quickly. And we can also, if we're successful, use the nature of our organisation in terms of its quality control systems. We can bring medical devices to market. We can use our marketing team and commercial partners to scale and productize those things. Conversely, by working with the Bristol group, we can run the kind of systematic evaluation and high-level publication process that is necessary to bring confidence and ultimately key opinion leader and doctor acceptance and patient acceptance. So as a way to get the right evidence in place and then get it known that these are applications that can be recommended, can be relied on. I've done very little of this personally, so this is largely to the credit of the two professors in Bristol, Marcus Manafoni and Penton Vogue. Jim Lumsden, who is a PhD student that has been jointly funded by Cambridge Cognition and Bristol, working here in Bristol. When you move these relationships from a scientific collaboration to a commercial transaction, when there needs to be licensing and intellectual property agreements and all those kinds of things, there's lots of little bumps along that road, and indeed if you go on to make successful products and do very well of them, it's very important that those little bumps get ironed out early on. So people like Sue Sundstrom in the RED, the Research Enterprise Development Team, and Chris Gerald, the head of school, have been very supportive in making sure that those things don't become blockers. I think that good relationships such as we have with Ian and Marcus can survive these commercial transactions. Good friendships don't get broken by these things, but it does take a certain amount of willpower by all concerned to make it through. Louis Chung is our KTP associate, currently based in Cambridge, and Kiri Granger is my colleague in Cambridge. So I want to thank all of those for their contribution to this work. Thank you.